The foundation of the global economy, built painstakingly over 50 years of liberalization, is cracking. We've grown accustomed to a world where a microchip designed in California is fabricated in Taiwan, assembled into a phone in Shenzhen, and shipped in a container made in South Korea, all for maximum efficiency and minimum cost. This system, driven by the ruthless logic of comparative advantage, lifted billions out of poverty and delivered consumers unprecedented choice. But the political consensus that sustained this deeply intertwined global supply chain has evaporated. We are watching the dawn of a new era, one defined not by cooperation and efficiency, but by decoupling and competition. The simple pursuit of profit is now secondary to the complex calculation of national security and geopolitical leverage. The economic map of the world is being redrawn, and this tectonic shift is creating fault lines beneath the feet of every major industry, every government treasury, and ultimately, every individual household. The seamless flow of capital, goods, and technology is being deliberately broken, replaced by strategic redundancy and domestic self-sufficiency, a costly shift that promises to redefine global productivity and reignite long-dormant inflation. This is not just a trade war. It is the fundamental re-engineering of the global economic engine. The immediate signs of this strategic retreat are visible in key economic indicators. Look at the exchange rate volatility in emerging markets heavily dependent on global investment, or the surging cost of goods sold reports for manufacturers relying on cross-border supply chains. Interest rates, specifically the cost of long-term borrowing, are being pressured upwards as governments prioritize domestic resilience, which often translates into massive spending on subsidies and infrastructure, a crowding out effect. Furthermore, the CDS, credit default swap, market for highly exposed sectors, such as advanced manufacturing or technology reliant on specific raw materials from competing nations, shows a palpable increase in perceived risk. We are seeing a deceleration in global cross-border capital flows, a reversal of decades of integration, as investors pull back from regions deemed geopolitically sensitive. This isn't theoretical. Companies are actively reporting billions in sunk costs related to reshoring or friendshoring operations, signaling that political risk is now a measurable line item on the balance sheet, outweighing years of efficiency gains. How does this geopolitical friction translate into a palpable economic shock? Consider the liquidity of critical commodities. When a major power imposes sanctions on a rival or restricts the export of a strategically vital resource, be it rare earth minerals or refined oil products, it injects uncertainty into the global market. The usual shock absorption mechanisms fail. Reserves are drained, price volatility spikes, and hedging becomes prohibitively expensive. This translates directly to higher input costs for manufacturers and increased consumer prices, feeding structural inflation. In the past, market efficiency quickly found alternatives, but in this new paradigm, alternatives are blocked by political walls, not just logistical barriers. This deliberate fragmentation of the market creates regional price disparities and supply bottlenecks that are not easily smoothed over by trade agreements or central bank interventions. The shock isn't just a bump, it's a sustained systemic pressure on the global price level, challenging the long-held assumption of cheap, abundant goods. To grasp the gravity of decoupling, we can compare it to historical examples where countries faced abrupt external economic withdrawal. Consider the Asian financial crisis of 1997. The IMF intervention in countries like Thailand and South Korea was driven by massive capital flight and excessive external debt, forcing painful structural adjustments. That was a crisis of contagion within an integrated system. Today's crisis is one of deliberate separation. Or look at Venezuela and Turkey, where geopolitical isolation combined with domestic policy errors led to hyperinflation and catastrophic exchange rate collapse, wiping out savings. While the U.S. and China are not facing total isolation. Their strategic withdrawal from deep integration forces, smaller third-party nations, like Vietnam, Mexico, or the nations of Central Europe, to make binary choices, creating friction and inefficiency across regional manufacturing hubs. The choice between security and efficiency is forcing every government to restructure its foreign investment strategy, leading to a global slowdown in cross-border M&A activity and a revaluation of political stability above financial return. The primary impact on the U.S. economy manifests as a persistent headwind against disinflation. For decades, access to cheap global manufacturing was a major buffer against rising domestic costs. As firms are pressured to reshore or friendshore, production costs inevitably rise. This is felt directly by the American consumer, not just in the price of electronics or apparel, but in the real estate sector as well. Increased construction costs, driven by supply chain constraints on materials like steel or lumber, now subject to geopolitical trade restrictions, translate into higher housing prices, further stressing affordability. Moreover, decoupling creates sector-specific vulnerabilities. U.S. technology companies face restricted access to massive overseas markets and specialized manufacturing capacity, leading to lower projected earnings growth and downward pressure on valuations, particularly in the Nasdaq Composite. This rise in structural costs directly contradicts the Federal Reserve's goal of returning to a stable 2% inflation target, making the maintenance of high interest rates a more likely, long-term reality. The complexity of this decoupling forces central banks and governments into a difficult policy trade-off. Historically, the U.S. Federal Reserve focused almost exclusively on managing domestic demand and core inflation. Now, they must contend with inflation driven not by excess money supply, but by geopolitical supply-side shocks, a problem their monetary tools are ill-suited to fix. Raising interest rates to curb geopolitical inflation only risks triggering a deeper recession without solving the underlying supply fragmentation. Meanwhile, governments are actively intervening, employing massive industrial subsidies like the CHIPS Act or the Inflation Reduction Act, intended to create secure, domestic supply chains. While politically popular, these interventions distort capital allocation and increase sovereign borrowing. This simultaneous pursuit of security through spending and inflation control through rate hikes creates internal policy conflict, risking fiscal dominance where the government's spending goals undermine the central bank's independence and effectiveness. The immediate consequence for ordinary individuals in the U.S. is the erosion of real wages and purchasing power. The cost of manufacturing essential goods is rising, and the inflation resulting from supply chain friction, unlike demand-driven inflation, is persistent and difficult to escape. Families find their budgets squeezed by higher prices for everything from appliances to automobiles. Furthermore, the risk profile of American investments is changing. Portfolios heavily weighted toward globally integrated, emerging market-focused companies face increased volatility and regulatory risk. The stability, once provided by diverse, low-cost supply networks, is replaced by the risk of political expropriation or sudden market access restrictions. This necessitates a fundamental reassessment of personal investment diversification, moving beyond simple geographic spread to include geopolitical risk factors as a primary metric for capital allocation. The history of systemic economic instability is littered with case studies of countries that failed to adapt to geopolitical pressure. Take Argentina, which has repeatedly faced capital flight and debt crises exacerbated by a lack of stable external relations and reliance on volatile commodity markets. Or Greece, whose sovereign debt crisis was deepened by the inflexible political demands of the Eurozone powers, creating a feedback loop of austerity and recession. These examples, though different in scale from the U.S. challenge, underscore a critical truth. When external political forces overwhelm domestic economic resilience, the exchange rate becomes highly vulnerable, leading to mass inflation and the collapse of the local purchasing power. For the U.S., the risk isn't currency collapse, but rather the slow, structural weakening of the dollar's global standing as other nations seek politically neutral trading mechanisms, accelerating the trend toward de-dollarization in energy and commodity trades. For individuals seeking to navigate this challenging environment, practical insights are paramount. The first strategy is diversification away from single country or single sector exposure that is highly dependent on the old globalization model. Rethink investment in firms that rely entirely on just-in-time, cross-border sourcing. Instead, favor companies with strong domestic or friend-shored redundancy and robust inventory management. Secondly, monitor geopolitical flashpoints not just for news headlines, but for their direct economic implications on key commodities and currencies. High volatility in the Turkish lira or the Japanese yen, for example, can signal broader shifts in global liquidity and risk appetite that will eventually affect U.S. markets. Finally, prioritize investments that hedge against persistent inflation, such as real assets or firms with high pricing power, as the era of cheap deflationary goods imports appears to be drawing to a close. This geopolitical economic shift demands a more defensive and localized investment posture. The long-term implications of decoupling on global reserves and currency status are profound. Historically, the U.S. dollar's dominance has been underpinned by the secure and deep markets of the U.S. Treasury, the use of the dollar in energy trading, the petrodollar system, and the overwhelming size of the U.S. economy. However, as geopolitical rivals seek to reduce their exposure to U.S. sanctions and financial leverage, they are actively building alternative clearing systems and settling bilateral trades in local currencies. This shift won't happen overnight, but the gradual diversification of reserves by central banks, moving slowly out of U.S. treasuries and into gold or other neutral assets, is a measurable sign of eroding confidence in the dollar's status as a politically neutral global medium of exchange. While the dollar remains supreme for now, the incremental decline in its global share of trade settlement represents a quiet but significant financial risk to U.S. power and the cost of capital. The phenomenon of friendshoring is a direct policy response to decoupling, aimed at securing supply chains by moving production to politically aligned nations. While conceptually sound, prioritizing reliability over pure cost, it introduces a new layer of economic friction. It limits the pool of potential suppliers, inherently raising costs, and potentially creates new dependencies on a smaller, geopolitically defined group of nations. For instance, reliance on countries like Mexico or India, while strategically desirable for the U.S., exposes supply chains to their unique domestic political and logistical risks. Furthermore, friendshoring requires massive infrastructure investment and capacity building in recipient nations, often straining their ability to absorb large capital inflows quickly, leading to domestic inflation and real estate bubbles in these new manufacturing hubs. This selective globalization creates economic winners and losers based purely on political alignment, fragmenting the global economy into rival economic blocs. The energy sector stands as a primary battlefield in this new economic conflict. The geopolitical risks surrounding oil and gas supply create massive volatility, directly impacting transportation costs and manufacturing expenses globally. When conflicts erupt, as seen in certain regions affecting major pipelines or shipping lanes, the market reacts immediately, driving up the price of oil futures. This volatility is increasingly being used as a strategic weapon, contributing to economic instability in rival nations. Moreover, the push toward green energy, while necessary, is also framed by geopolitical competition, specifically in the control over critical battery minerals and solar panel production. The country that controls the mining and processing of lithium, cobalt, and rare earths gains significant leverage over the future of the automotive and power sectors, turning the transition to clean energy into another front in the decoupling wars. The comparison with Venezuela offers a chilling perspective on how geopolitical risk, when combined with severe policy missteps, can destroy an economy. While the U.S. faces external pressures, Venezuela's collapse stemmed largely from internal political decisions that led to international isolation and heavy sanctions. This resulted in a near-total collapse of the bolivar's exchange rate and hyperinflation that rendered the local currency worthless, demonstrating the catastrophic power of financial and trade decoupling when aggressively applied. Though the U.S. remains the anchor of the global system, the lesson for American companies is clear. Reliance on predictable, rules-based international trade cannot be assumed. Companies must build financial firewalls against sudden market closures, capital controls, or even the seizure of assets, risks once confined to highly unstable economies, but now increasingly relevant in the context of major power competition. Technology transfer has become the zero-sum game of the new Cold War economy. Governments are leveraging national security frameworks to restrict the flow of key technologies, particularly in the fields of quantum computing, advanced semiconductors, and military-grade AI. This move is fundamentally fracturing the global innovation ecosystem. American companies are prohibited from selling certain advanced components to geopolitical rivals, and in retaliation, those rivals are building indigenous alternatives, often backed by immense state subsidies. This duplication of effort is highly inefficient on a global scale, but it achieves the strategic goal of vulnerability reduction. The impact on investment is immediate. Venture capital is now flowing predominantly into domestic, protected supply chains for critical tech, bypassing previously lucrative international collaborative efforts. The intellectual property landscape is becoming balkanized, creating costly regulatory hurdles and significantly slowing the pace of globally shared innovation. The rising cost of maintaining geopolitical stability is directly reflected in sovereign debt levels. Countries engaging in decoupling strategies are committing massive fiscal resources to subsidize domestic industries and secure strategic supplies. This spending, on things like building new foundries, researching domestic AI, or stockpiling critical minerals, is often non-productive in the immediate term, meaning it does not generate immediate economic growth sufficient to offset the borrowing costs. Consequently, the national debt burdens in major economic blocs are escalating. Higher debt increases the government's sensitivity to rising interest rates, creating a vicious cycle where the policy response to geopolitical risk, i.e., spending, undermines fiscal stability and potentially crowds out private sector investment. This phenomenon makes every future economic downturn more perilous, as the fiscal space available for countercyclical spending is severely constrained. The banking sector faces complex new risks under decoupling. Beyond traditional credit and market risks, institutions must now stress test against political event risk. A sudden escalation of geopolitical tensions can trigger capital controls, making it impossible for banks to retrieve assets or profits from certain jurisdictions. The market for CDS on corporate debt is beginning to reflect this, with increased premia for firms heavily invested in rival economic blocs, regardless of their immediate financial health. Furthermore, the risk of exclusion from critical financial infrastructures, similar to how certain nations have been cut off from the SWIFT system, forces banks to maintain redundant, often less efficient, payment systems. This adds operational complexity and cost, undermining the efficiency gains that drove financial globalization. Banks must now dedicate significant resources, not just to compliance, but to active geopolitical risk modeling. The experience of Greece during its sovereign debt crisis provides a cautionary tale about how external political rigidity can amplify internal economic pain. While the crisis was fundamentally about unsustainable borrowing, the political decisions made by the Eurozone powers, enforcing strict austerity and refusing to permit devaluation, trapped Greece in a severe, prolonged depression. This illustrates that when geopolitics dictates economic policy, financial solutions become secondary to strategic leverage. In the context of the new Cold War economy, this means that trade disputes or technology restrictions are less about achieving market efficiency and more about imposing costs or extracting concessions from rivals. This highly politicized environment means companies and investors cannot rely on predictable, rules-based resolutions to disputes. Instead, they must calculate the risk of being caught as collateral damage in a high-stakes geopolitical confrontation. The implications for global poverty and development are severe. The old model of globalization relied on integrating developing nations into complex value chains, offering them a pathway to growth through export-oriented manufacturing. Decoupling, however, creates barriers, forcing these nations to choose sides or risk being left out of major markets. The fragmentation increases the cost of capital and technology transfer, hindering industrialization efforts. Furthermore, the volatility in commodity prices, fueled by geopolitical conflicts, disproportionately harms low-income countries, dependent on stable revenues from raw materials. The ability of multilateral organizations like the IMF and the World Bank to coordinate global economic stability is also weakened as their major funders diverge on strategic economic priorities. This suggests a future where global inequality could widen again, reversing decades of progress driven by an integrated world economy. Individual survival strategies in this new economy must focus on building personal resilience against political shocks. For career paths, this means favoring sectors with domestic essential demand, such as healthcare, education, or utilities, or those industries benefiting directly from government reshoring subsidies. Avoid hyper-specialized, internationally vulnerable manufacturing roles. For savings, practical insights include holding a portion of assets in politically neutral safe havens, such as physical gold or established international blue-chip companies with diversified geographic revenue streams. Furthermore, recognizing that decoupling will likely lead to persistent, although moderate inflation, individuals should aggressively pay down high-interest, non-deductible debt as the real cost of debt decreases with inflation. But the financial strain of higher interest rates, driven by central banks attempting to fight supply-side inflation, remains acute. The response from governments to the decoupling challenge is dominated by the concept of techno-nationalism. This is the belief that technological superiority is synonymous with national power and economic security. This ideology directly justifies massive state intervention and protectionism. It manifests in export controls, forced technology licensing, and the aforementioned industrial subsidies. While aiming for security, techno-nationalism risks creating inefficient national champions, companies that thrive not through global competition and innovation, but through state protection and subsidized funding. This protectionism ultimately imposes a hidden tax on consumers and businesses through higher prices and less innovative products, proving that the pursuit of sovereignty in key technologies often comes at the direct expense of economic efficiency and consumer welfare. Real estate markets are fundamentally altered by decoupling, particularly in metropolitan areas that thrived as global commerce hubs. The increase in trade barriers and the reduction in cross-border capital flow can slow the demand for commercial office space in cities traditionally reliant on international business services. Conversely, the policy of reshoring manufacturing and logistics creates unexpected booms in secondary cities and strategic port locations, driving up demand and prices for industrial and logistics properties. Furthermore, the volatility in global bond yields, driven by the increased sovereign debt issuance related to geopolitical spending, translates directly into higher long-term mortgage interest rates. This combination of shifts, slowing international commercial demand, and increasing long-term borrowing costs, creates an uneven and structurally more expensive real estate market for both businesses and homeowners. A deep dive into global case studies reveals how quickly perceived financial stability can erode under geopolitical pressure. Take the Turkish lira's experience. While domestic policy missteps were the primary driver of rapid inflation and high interest rates. Geopolitical tensions, particularly with Western allies, exacerbated the currency's decline by triggering periodic capital flight and investor loss of confidence. This demonstrated a critical feedback loop. Geopolitical tension reduces the perceived safety of assets, which drives down the exchange rate, which in turn forces the central bank to intervene with massive and often ineffective rate hikes or reserve sales. This dynamic teaches American investors that even indirect geopolitical disputes can quickly amplify economic instability in allied countries, increasing the cost of capital and making international business operations significantly more complex and expensive. The challenge of managing liquidity in a decoupling world extends beyond commodities to sovereign bonds. As major economic powers strategically reduce their reliance on holding each other's debt, a move driven by the risk of financial sanctions, the depth and reliability of government bond markets may be subtly compromised. While the U.S. Treasury market remains the global benchmark, a slow, deliberate reduction in foreign central bank holdings necessitates new domestic buyers, often at higher yields, increasing the government's borrowing costs. For the individual investor, this means that the bedrock of low-risk, fixed-income returns is now subject to subtle geopolitical forces, potentially making U.S. long-term bonds a less effective hedge against market volatility than in past decades, pushing investors towards more complex, inflation-indexed instruments. The stress on corporate balance sheets is becoming increasingly visible through the lens of credit default swaps, CDS. For multinational corporations with significant operations or revenues tied to rival geopolitical blocs, the cost of insuring their debt against default has risen sharply. This isn't necessarily due to poor operational management, but rather the sudden introduction of high political risk, the chance of an abrupt market exclusion, regulatory retaliation, or asset freezes. This increased CDS spread acts as a financial headwind, making corporate borrowing more expensive and impacting investment decisions. Companies are effectively being charged a geopolitical premium by the financial markets, forcing them to hold greater cash reserves and reduce leverage, ultimately slowing their capital expenditure and, consequently, global economic growth. The crucial lesson for individuals, often overlooked in the macroeconomic analysis, is the need for enhanced professional adaptability. As supply chains restructure and industries shift from highly centralized, efficient models to more decentralized, politically secure ones, the demand for specific skills changes. There is a growing premium on professionals who can manage regulatory compliance across rival jurisdictions, understand complex sanctions regimes, and implement diversified logistics and inventory management systems. Skills often grouped under the umbrella of geopolitical risk mitigation. Workers who can translate political and regulatory mandates into operational changes will command higher value, while those whose roles were optimized purely for the old, efficient globalization model may find their skill sets becoming obsolete in the newly balkanized economic landscape. Career resilience is now tied directly to geopolitical awareness. The response of the U.S. government, while necessary for national security, often comes with significant moral hazard. By underwriting massive investments in strategic domestic industries via subsidies and tax breaks, the government sends a signal that these sectors are too critical to fail. This encourages excessive risk-taking and potentially inefficient capital allocation within these protected industries. Companies may prioritize lobbying for continued state support over achieving genuine global competitiveness or innovation. Furthermore, this heavy-handed intervention distorts the signals provided by free markets, making it harder for private investors to determine where true economic value lies, thus leading to mispricing of assets and potentially creating sector-specific bubbles reliant on continued fiscal support, a risk that needs careful monitoring by the Federal Reserve and financial regulators. The comparison with the IMF's role during the 1997 Asian financial crisis is instructive in the geopolitical context. In 1997, the IMF, acting as a global financial referee, imposed strict conditions in exchange for bailouts, enforcing painful but necessary structural reforms that eventually led to renewed stability and growth across Asia. However, in the current climate of decoupling, the efficacy of such multilateral institutions is challenged. Competing economic blocs may refuse to cooperate or submit to the structural oversight of institutions perceived to be dominated by their rivals. This lack of a unified, globally respected financial authority means that when the next major sovereign debt crisis or regional contagion hits, the mechanisms for coordinated rescue and resolution will be fractured, leading to longer, more volatile, and more politically charged financial emergencies. The new Cold War economy forces us to confront a fundamental trade-off. Is the cost of efficiency worth the price of vulnerability? For half a century, the pursuit of maximum economic efficiency, the lowest cost, the fastest delivery, was the ultimate good. But in a world where geopolitical leverage is prized above profit, the calculus changes. The decoupling we are witnessing is not a temporary blip. It is a structural shift towards a more resilient, redundant, and ultimately, more expensive global economy. This new reality demands a mindset shift from every government, corporation, and household. The age of abundant, cheap goods facilitated by frictionless global supply chains is likely over. The future will be defined by scarcity, strategic prioritization, and the lingering presence of structural inflation. The vital question is whether the increased security gained through decoupling will justify the reduced economic growth and the higher burden it places on the consumer. The stability of the system may increase, but the prosperity of the individual may be simultaneously diminished. How does this story resonate with you? I'd like to hear your perspective, so feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. If you found this video useful, consider subscribing and giving it a like. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.